The White House is now slamming ESPN after its anchor, Jemele Hill, criticized President Trump as a white supremacist on Twitter. Trump got into it today, tweeting, calling for an apology. Hill wrote that Trump's rise is a direct result of white supremacy, period, end quote. Now, that view draws on Trump's praise for some people at that Charlottesville white supremacy rally, which Trump managed to return to again this week.
You look at, really what's happened since Charlottesville. A lot of people are saying, in fact, a lot of people have actually written, gee, Trump might have a point. I said you got some very bad people on the other side also, which is true.
Trump's refusal to flatly condemn one side in that white supremacy fight and instead embrace a broader moral equivalence about the, quote, other side has stirred a pot of racial resentment for weeks now. In fact, this week, you may not have heard much about it, but Congress passed a unanimous resolution to condemn one side, racist hate groups, and reject Trump's rhetoric. That debate is, of course, the context for ESPN anchor Jemele Hill's comments. She also posted on Facebook a new essay by author Ta-Nehisi Coates arguing Trump's embrace of white supremacy is the core of his appeal. That piece is called The First White President. So what would Coates think about this debate, which grows partly out of his provocative essay? Well, tonight on All In with Chris Hayes, he talked directly about how Trump is trying to play the victim by calling on ESPN to punish someone for criticizing him.
This is what white supremacists tend to do, going back to the days of slaveholders who insisted that, in fact, the North was trying to subjugate them and turn them into actual slaves. It's always the white supremacist who's being offended. It's always him that something's being done to. So I think it's, pretty characteristic in our form.
That is the fight between ESPN and Trump, which is partly a battle between a political entity, more or less, and a corporate entity over drawing lines for speech. That's really a strategic battle when you get down to it. What about the underlying ethical allegation here? Well, Coates points to public evidence.
If you own a business that attempts to keep black people from renting from you, if you are reported to say that you don't want black people counting your money, if you say, and not even reported, just come out and say someone can't judge your case because they're Mexican, if your response to the first black president is that they weren't born in this country, despite all proof, if you say they weren't smart enough to go to Harvard Law School and demand to see their grades, if that's the essence of your entire political identity, you might be a white supremacist.
Strong words and a lot of evidence. Up next, Ta-Nehisi Coates explains further why he believes Trump is fundamentally different from other Republican leaders, and I'll be joined by Zerlina Maxwell and Karine Jean-Pierre to weigh in live.
I wouldn't say George Bush is a white supremacist. Now, I have a lot of problems with George Bush's policies. I can make an argument for how they, affect black people in a negative way.
Right.
You know what I mean? But I wouldn't argue that he's a white supremacist. I wouldn't argue that Mitt Romney is a white supremacist. Donald Trump is a particular specific thing, and I think there's quite a bit of evidence to back up the charge. It's the core of him. He began his career in birtherism. It wasn't on the way. That was the thing that got it started. That was what kicked it off. And so I think in that sense, he's different.
That's what got it started. I'm joined now by Zerlina Maxwell, Director of Progressive Programming for SiriusXM and a former aide to Hillary Clinton, and Karine Jean-Pierre, a senior advisor, national spokesperson for MoveOn.org, and a veteran of several campaigns. Zerlina, on the one hand, the White House appears to want to be in a fight with ESPN.
Right.
On the other hand, as you hear Ta-Nehisi Coates, a very thoughtful and celebrated author, engaging the underpinnings of this, that Barack Obama caused a backlash, that many Republican leaders, to their initial credit, did not fully engage.
Right.
And Donald Trump stood up in 2011 and 2012 and embraced racist birtherism.
But it was a little complicated because while they didn't endorse birtherism or say, I agree with Donald Trump that the first black president wasn't born in the United States, they would say things like, well, I believe Barack Obama when he says he was not born in Kenya. And the underlying message there is, if you're talking to the Republican base, they don't believe anything Barack Obama says. So if the message is, well, I believe Obama when he says he was born in the United States, the message to the base is he wasn't born in the United States. And I think that Donald Trump stoked a lot of the racial resentment in the wake of the economic downturn. You know, that affected people of all races, but particularly white working class voters in the Rust Belt. And so Donald Trump stoked that resentment, and he went to the White House. As a result, he ran on white identity.
You say he ran on white identity. Coates talks about it, that if race is in part a myth, Donald Trump, he argues, is the first white president because in this current modern era, he has appealed so directly and blatantly to whiteness as a political strategy. When you see the White House then trying to turn this and say, the president, A, should be able to say they're good people at a white supremacist rally, but B, should be offended when people, factually point out that he is giving comfort to people at a white supremacist rally?
Well, I mean, I think it's important to always look at the facts. I mean, there are myriad examples of President Trump saying and doing things that some people would consider racist. Now, I'm not saying that every single person that voted for Donald Trump also shares those views, but they certainly overlooked those views and supported him in the election. And I think that that's the tricky question. I think that's why you get a certain level of defensiveness, because in defending Donald Trump's actions and the things that he's said that are racist, right, saying Mexicans are rapists, banning Muslims from coming into the country, saying black people live in hell, those things are racist, right, objectively, and offensive to those communities of people. And so in order to say that the people that overlooked those things, including the Access Hollywood tape also, and voted for him, may have some ill feelings towards those groups of people as well, that's when you get into trouble. That's when people get very defensive. And I think it's important that we're having this conversation in this country, because until we actually are honest about it, we're never going to move past it.
Corinne?
Yeah, I think it's very clear that Donald Trump is a racist. I mean, birtherism for sure. I mean, it goes back to when his first kind of start in business was making sure that black people were not able to get housing, and then you have the Central Park Five and what he did there, and accusing them of being guilty, asking for their execution, and even when they were found not guilty, he still never apologized for anything, taking out that big ad in the 80s. I mean, it continues and continues. And when he jumped into the presidential campaign, he insulted Mexicans. I mean, so there's a clear pattern. There's decades of patterns here of Donald Trump being a racist. And here's the thing. The Republican Party is indeed, they built him. They enabled him. Let's not forget, back in 2012, when Mitt Romney was having his convention, when the Republicans were having their convention in Tampa, they invited Donald Trump to speak during the convention. And this is a year after Donald Trump basically was the voice of birtherism.
Well, I think,
so I think
it cuts both ways, right? I mean, either it was always this way and Donald Trump is just continuing it, or it wasn't and he is of something different. I mean, Coates' argument is that he is explicitly, distinctly worse and different than some of these other leaders. As for where the supporters are, I mean, I'll say what other people say, and it's just anecdotal reporting experience. I went to a lot of Trump rallies. I met a lot of great people. I met people who clearly weren't racist. And yet you have this. And Corinne, let me put up some data on a very basic question. This is 2017. Are all races equal? Okay? Shouldn't be a hard question. And about 18% of Americans won't agree with that statement. So 2017, 18% of people, that would be a floor, not a ceiling, because you might not want to admit that and feel it. What does it tell you that 18% of people can't sign on to the idea that we are equal?
It doesn't surprise me, Ari, because of just look at where we are today. I mean, racism is definitely it's institutional, right? And even in the interview that Chris Hayes had with Ta-Nehisi, which was where the difference was that there are different levels, right? There are different levels for how people experience racism, and there are different space. There are different kind of how do I want to say how did he say that was really perfect? He says that people you have to do more in order to reach a level like for President Obama to be president, right? He had to be gone to Harvard Law School. There was a lot for him to do, where Donald Trump, he had no political at all experience. And so that is, I feel like that is the difference here. There is a difference in this institutional racism that we see. And so, and here's another point too that I really want to make sure that I talk about with the ESPN part. Just a couple of days ago, you had a white Miss Texas say the same thing that a black ESPN host said. You didn't hear anything from the White House about that. It was silence about that.
He also singled out the only black member of his business council and attacked him when he dropped out after his comments on Charlottesville. He didn't attack the white CEOs. I'm not saying that he realizes in the moment that he's attacking the black people over the white people, but I think that there's a clear pattern, and it would be a dereliction of our duty if we did not acknowledge that.
Zerlina Maxwell and Karine Jean-Pierre, thank you both for an important discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up, the ethics. What happened today with the Trump Legal Defense Fund to foot bills in the Russia probe?
I've actually written, gee, Trump might have a point. I said you got some very bad people on the other side also, which is true.
Trump's refusal to flatly condemn one side in that white supremacy fight and instead embrace a broader moral equivalence about the, quote, other side has stirred. Posted on Facebook a new essay by author Ta-Nehisi Coates arguing Trump's embrace of white supremacy is the core of his appeal. That piece is called The First White President. So what would Coates think about this debate, which grows partly out of his provocative essay? Well, tonight on All In, a pot of racial resentment for weeks now. In fact, this week, you may not have heard much about it, but Congress passed a unanimous resolution to condemn one side, racist hate groups, and reject Trump's rhetoric. That debate is, of course, the context for ESPN anchor Jemele Hill's comments. She also, that view draws on Trump's praise for some people at that Charlottesville white supremacy rally, which Trump managed to return to again this week.
You look at, really what's happened since Charlottesville. A lot of people are saying, in fact, a lot of people.
The White House is now slamming ESPN after its anchor, Jemele Hill, criticized President Trump as a white supremacist on Twitter. Trump got into it today, tweeting, calling for an apology. Hill wrote that Trump's rise is a direct result of white supremacy, period, end quote.